teaching and learning with a barefoot heart and a barefoot brain, contemplative practices in teacher education. I'd like to pass the spotlight to Professor William Greene. So tell us, William, should we take off our shoes in preparing for your presentation?
Absolutely. Let me first of all say what an honor it is to be here. Crew Victoria, it was a very moving presentation to hear you. And I was particularly touched by your own unfolding as an educator and understanding yourself to understand your students. That was a beautiful way to frame your experience, and very honest and genuine. Ajahn Prabhupada and Samsit and Lada, and to all of my friends at Rungaroon, I'm really happy to be here, and it was so grateful to be invited. I will make some short remarks, but I'd like to begin with a small exercise that I'd like to ask us to participate in, if you're willing. Are your shoes off? Okay. This is an exercise I do sometimes with my students, and when we do it, we look each other in the eyes. But today, because we're on Zoom, we have to be a little creative. So I'm going to ask you to find, if you're okay, if you're comfortable with this, I'd like you to find somebody's picture on the screen. Doesn't matter who, and you don't have to say. But I would just like you for the next minute or so to just look at that person. Okay? Is that okay with everybody? So just please focus on one person now and just look at them for just a few comments here. And with your attention on this person, I'd like you to repeat to yourself, just like me, this person is seeking some happiness in his or her life. And with your attention still on the person, please repeat to yourself, just like me, this person is trying to avoid suffering in his or her life. Just like me, this person has known sadness, loneliness, and despair. Just like me, this person is seeking to fulfill his or her needs. Just like me, this person is learning about life. Thank you. This is known as a compassion exercise. And of course, there are a million variations on it. In the book, The Heart of Learning, Spirituality and Education, His Holiness the Dalai Lama writes, just like the compassion exercise, that we are all the same. We are the same in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering, and we are the same in experiencing the vicissitudes of both. In the same book, The Heart of Learning, Stephen Glaser writes, education within the spiritual and contemplative traditions is very much about seeing the permeability of the barriers between self and other, opening us to the point where there is real presence, interaction, and engagement with the world. Teaching with a barefoot heart and a barefoot brain is a title that comes from an Irish philosopher and man of letters, John Moriarty, who reflects as a mystic might on the significance of our lives in the world, and that we should all have the courage and the grace to walk this great and sacred earth with a barefoot heart and a barefoot brain. As a teacher or a student yourself, what does this metaphor bring up for you? Maybe a sense of openness or vulnerability, curiosity or wonder, tenderness or sensitivity. I find John's imagery and his metaphor to be a powerful example of how we might approach our teaching and for how we treat each other. And it always reminds me in my work about the importance of stepping lightly and treading gently on the sacred paths we walk in our classrooms every day. So I'd like to just, in these next few minutes, I'd like to share 3 concepts that I use to frame a particular approach to my classes, no matter what I teach. And then at the end today, I'll just share briefly one concrete example of an activity that I have adapted over the years and borrowed from the writer Parker Palmer. So the first idea that I'd like to share in this regard is just the idea of the sacred, and that we can think of the sacred in a classroom as we think of it in nature and in other places. By definition, we might say that the sacred refers to something worthy of or regarded with reverence or awe or respect, even mystery. And like various notions of the soul or spirit, we can sense it even when we can't see it. I think this is related to Jack Miller's idea about the role of the holistic educator, as he once said in one of our conferences, and that is to ignite the divine spark. But Rachel Kessler talked about it this way. She said, "Everyday souls walk into your classroom. If you fail to notice them, you miss the point. When souls enter the classroom, masks drop away." And Parker Palmer himself talked about it this way. "I mean," he said, "the ancient and abiding human quest for connectedness with something larger and more trustworthy than our egos, with our own souls, with one another, with the worlds of history and nature, with the invisible winds of the spirit, with the mystery of being alive." The second idea I'd like to use to frame the example I'll share with you later is the notion of vulnerability. Vulnerability in the environment of teaching and learning. We're all familiar with that. One of the premier researchers, but also very popular speaker on the topic of vulnerability is Brené Brown. I am told that her TED Talk is one of the 5 most watched TED Talks in the world. And perhaps you've seen hers on the power of vulnerability. One of the things she researched was the difference between people who do things with their whole heart and people who don't. And one thing she found was that people who did things wholeheartedly had in common was that they fully embraced the notion of being vulnerable. In fact, they believed that what made them vulnerable made them beautiful. They talked about the willingness to say, "I love you," first. The willingness to do something where there were no guarantees. To invest in a relationship that may or may not work out. Vulnerability, as she framed it, was the birthplace of joy, creativity, belonging, and love. A few comments from my students reflect the kind of vulnerability they've experienced in classes, and I'll just share a couple with you now, short ones. My reaction to my life's experiences have become disconnected from my true self. Somehow, I have forgotten that I can be vulnerable. Another one, I forgive my mom. I forgive my dad. I still feel broken, but I know this is what must happen so that I can fully let go, to fully devote myself to my family that I have created. Our topic of forgiveness is what led me to this realization and deep reflection in my personal life. The third idea that I'll use to frame the example in a moment is the idea of presence. Something we've heard a lot about, talked a lot about, very much, I think, a very important aspect of this conference and of the work that I've been involved in with some of you is developing a stronger sense of presence in myself. Abraham Cohen, who's from the Northwest here in the United States, once wrote, I believe presence is equivalent to love. Giving full presence to another is, I believe, the greatest gift a person can offer. Jack Miller writes about the gift of presence as the 8th form of love in his book, Love and Compassion in Education. He said, presence is an elusive quality, but we know it when we encounter it in another person who is listening with their whole being. Genuine presence has a healing quality. Presence is critically important in teaching. When we reflect on teachers who made a difference in our lives, it is often their presence, rather than their pedagogy, that made the difference. So with those three ideas in mind, the notion of the sacred, the notion of vulnerability, and the ideas of presence, and all that that means to you, I'll talk just a moment about an activity that I do in several of my classes. I began this about 12 years ago, and it usually comes along about the 7th week or 8th week even of a 10-week term. So with enough time for me to get to know my students and them to get comfortable with me, for them to feel comfortable with each other. And we do an activity that I think brings together these notions of sacredness, vulnerability, and presence. In his book, A Hidden Wholeness, The Journey Toward an Undivided Life, Parker Palmer describes an activity that he calls a circle of trust as a space between us that honors the soul. He said, if we want to create a space that honors the soul, we must speak our own truth to the center of the circle and listen receptively as others speak theirs. In a circle of trust, we learn an alternative way to respond than we typically do in everyday conversations. It is centered on the rare art of asking open, honest questions. The kind of questions Ajahn Prabhupada loves to ask. Such questions, when they're asked in a safe space, invite the inner teacher to say more about the matter at hand. And they give the speaker a chance to hear that voice, free of the static that we create by imposing our predilections on each other. So, to prepare for the circle of trust, I asked the students to read the chapter in Hidden Wholeness that's called Living the Questions. And it talks about ground rules that have been developed over many decades in Parker Palmer's work, but also in the Quaker tradition that he's from. Ground rules that encourage a kind of safety and a kind of openness that allows people to feel comfortable being vulnerable. So we do examples that talk about open and honest questions, what that means. We talk about an opportunity to be either a focus person, who is the person at the center of the circle or in the circle, who's the one that is getting an opportunity to seek clarity. And we talk about the role of the committee members, who are the 4 or 5 other people in a small circle whose only really role is to hold the bowl or hold presence or to witness, the person who is the focus person. I set up rooms in our institution that are dark, completely dark, with chairs in a small circle and candles in the middle. And when the students are ready, they enter the room in their groups, several, sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 groups in a class. The lights are off. The focus person is seated, and the others come in. They seat themselves in the circle. They begin with a moment of silence. How much silence is up to the focus person? The focus person, when they're ready, begins to share an issue or a question or a challenge in their life for which they would like to achieve some clarity. For Parker Palmer, his example of this in his own life, the 4 or 5 times that he has been a focus person, was that when he turned 70, he began to be concerned about his own fear of dying. And he asked, what is it that I fear most about the end of my life? And he called together trusted friends in a circle and became the focus person for the activity that followed. When the focus person has shared their question or their challenge or their issue, when committee members feel compelled or feel called to ask a question, they may. But only one question, an open, honest question, a question without an agenda, a question without a should or an ought, a question without a suggestion or advice, because those wouldn't be open, honest questions. But a question whose really sole purpose is to serve the focus person, to allow them an opportunity to go inside themselves and to listen to their own inner teacher. We do it in our classrooms, in my classrooms, for 1 hour, which at first seems like a long time to students. Say, an hour? We have to go for an hour, Dr. Greene? Parker Palmer's groups, when they hold retreats around the world, as they do the Courage to Teach retreats, very often do it for 2 hours. I've even heard of some groups going longer. But I can share with you that at the end of the hour, when students are ready to return to class and we sit quietly together for the final few minutes of class, it's virtually always a surprise to them that an hour has passed. So in my final few minutes, I want to share a couple of comments from students that give you an idea, perhaps, of why this fits with my view of holistic education or my view of contemplative education. And here are a few of their comments. I remember in the circle of trust feeling a part of something sacred. I remember feelings of uncertainty. I think the quiet spaces were very necessary to the process. Another person said, participating in the circle of trust was an extremely profound and powerful experience. There was so much emotion in the room that at times it felt a bit overwhelming, but I also felt I was part of something sacred. Another one said, most importantly, experiencing the immense care and compassion I felt for the focus person, not judgment, which I had feared if I ever shared my own similar experiences, helped me see myself as less damaged or broken and more deserving of love. And now a comment from someone who was a focus person themselves. I would like to start off by saying that this style of communication would not be possible if we did not have such a strong class. The people who participated as my committee were open-hearted, genuine, and I did not once feel that they were there out of force. As I sat down, my heart raced beyond belief. I was unsure how my committee might feel about my situation, and I was concerned for rejection. Even after just minutes, I recognized the compassion within the room and did not feel uncomfortable anymore. And one last comment from another person who was also a focus person. Being in a circle of trust this term made me realize that when you are in your darkest moment, you can get your brightest moments of clarity. Paulo Freire said that one of the most basic conditions necessary for true dialogue to occur is hope. And in their book, What's Worth Fighting For in Education, Andy Hargreaves and Michael Fullen said, more than anything else, more than expectations, passionate engagement, or standards, teaching is about hope. Every child is one teacher's hope for the future. Thank you for listening. I would like to end with one more student quote, and then I'll be happy to end. And I don't think we'll have any time for questions, so I'm sorry about that, unless the speakers would like to. The final comment from a student was, my speaker, she was talking about the focus person that she was in the room with, gave me hope in my life, gave me courage, and made me feel whole. I am human. I want to be loved and accepted, but more so, I want to be understood. I found myself wanting to be strong for them, to be a shoulder to cry on, but I couldn't because of the ground rules. Instead, I found myself swallowing my tears and wiping my eyes throughout the tail end of their story. That one still shakes me up a little bit to read that final quote, but I'll end there, and thank you so much. If you're interested in more about this, what the Clearness Committee is and how Parker Palmer frames it, you might want to get a hold of his book, Hidden Wholeness. All right. Thank you, Lada. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.